We're reading today from Romans chapter 10 and verse 1, where the Apostle Paul writes, "Brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For they, being ignorant of God's righteousness and seeking to establish their own righteousness, have not submitted to the righteousness of God. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes." Paul's heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they may be saved. This prayer is the culmination, if you like, of what Paul is saying in Romans chapter 9 and verse 3, where he says, "For I could wish that I myself were accursed from Christ for my brethren, my countrymen, according to the flesh, who are Israelites, to whom pertain the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the service of God, and the promises, of whom are the fathers, and from whom, according to the flesh, Christ came, who is over all, the eternally blessed God. Amen." Paul's heart's desire and prayer for all Israel is that they might be saved. It was Israel who were God's chosen people. It was Israel who God had brought out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery, and established them in the promised land. And yet they had rejected Jesus when he came. They had rejected him as Messiah because they thought that righteousness was based simply on observing the law. And Paul says here, Israel are so desperate to please God. Israel are so keen to obtain righteousness. And yet they've got this blind spot. They don't recognize who Jesus is. And he prays earnestly, this is his heart's desire, that all Israel may be saved. And yet, when you look at this prayer, there's something else going on here. And there is something that is truly, truly wonderful. And that is this. When you look at how the Jews had responded to the Apostle Paul as he preached the gospel of Jesus Christ, as he preached Jesus as the Messiah, the one who is risen from the dead, you see that they had been as violent towards Paul as he had been toward the church when he was persecuting the church. In Acts 13 in Pisidian Antioch, it says that the Jews spoke against what Paul taught and preached, and they raised persecution against Paul and Barnabas and expelled them from their coasts. And then in Acts chapter 14 verse 2, in Iconium, it says that the Jews stirred up the Gentiles and made their minds evil affected against the brethren. And then a little bit later on, again in Acts chapter 14 and verse 19, in Lystra, it says that they had Paul stoned and they left his body outside the walls. They just left him for dead. In Acts 23 verses 12 to 15, it speaks of a plot that the Jews made to kill Paul, and they vowed that they would not eat until they had killed Paul. Everything of Israel was antagonistic toward Paul. They rejected the message. They rejected him. They tried to kill him. Everything was against them. It would have been so easy for Paul just to say, do you know what? Forget about Israel. Forget about Israel. If that's how they're treating the gospel, if that's how they're treating me, if that's how they're treating Jesus, then forget them. But what we see is the grace of God that has been formed in Paul. Remember, Paul, before, when he was Saul of Tarsus, was a persecutor of the church. He was doing to the church the very same things that Israel were now doing to him. And yet on the Damascus road, that great light from heaven had flashed around him, and he'd fallen from his donkey, and the voice from heaven had come, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And when he says, "Who are you, Lord?" the voice comes again, "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." Paul sees that it is purely because of the grace of God that he has been saved, and that Jesus has called him from darkness to light. He wants the same grace to be extended to Israel, who was simply doing the same thing to him that he once did to Jesus Christ. He recognizes that this is not just hard-heartedness on Israel's part. They have a desire for righteousness, but they have not yet received the knowledge of who Jesus is as he has done. And so his prayer to them, his heart's desire and his prayer for Israel is that they may be saved, because they are acting in ignorance. Paul's prayer echoes the prayer of the true apostle, Jesus Christ, the apostle of our faith, who as he hung on the cross prayed, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." Paul wanted the same grace extended to Israel that the Lord had extended to him.